presenting to you by one of our very own Relate coordinators. Deanna Montgomery is going to present a not-so-brief history of opioids. Take it away.
Thanks, all. So this is a talk about history. Anybody in the room a historian? Taking no hands. Good. Me either. So this is a talk about history, but I am not a historian. And this is a talk about drugs, but I am not a medical professional. I am a scientist who studies opioids. And if asked to describe my work in 3 words, I say this: I make opioids. And upon occasion, I do say this, and there are a couple common responses that I get to this. The first of which is, what's an opioid? So how many in the room have heard the word opioid? It's been in the news a lot lately, right? So I have a lot of hands. So you may associate them with being pain medication, and in particular from the news, you may associate them with being highly addictive. Sound about right? Mm-hmm. So opioids actually do lots more besides treat pain and cause addiction, and hopefully by the end of the talk I'll have you on board with that idea that opioids do a lot more than just that. The second response that I commonly get when I say this is, like Breaking Bad? And the answer is, well, kinda. So I don't work in an RV. I work in an organic chemistry lab. It looks like this. But I am that stereotypical scientist that wears the long white lab coat, the gloves, and the goggles.
Bless you.
I do make drugs in the broadest sense of that phrase, but I don't make methamphetamine, or maybe better known as crystal meth. But I am a chemist, and the big picture of my work is looking to make new medicine. So in that sense, I make drugs. The third response that I get to this is, do we really need more of those? So people who often, like yourselves, have probably heard about opioids from the news question this, and I often get this question, which is sometimes voiced more as a snarky comment than a question. And so I hope that by the end of this talk, you'll be able to answer this question for yourself. And so to start our story, I have a question for all of you. Does anybody know what this is?
A poppy.
A poppy, right? So this is, in fact, the opium poppy, and the 3 different stages of that plant. So the bud, the flower, and the capsule. And most relevant to us right now is the capsule, this third picture. And so when you break that capsule open, inside there are a bunch of seeds called poppy seeds, right? So in this picture they're kind of brown, but once they dry out, they're black, and you may have seen them on your bagel for breakfast this morning, or in your salad dressing at lunch. But more importantly for this talk, before you break that open, if you scratch the surface of this capsule while it's growing, there's this milky white liquid that leaks out of it. And that liquid contains opium. And so opium has been around for a long time. And the first known use of opium dates all the way back to 3400 BC in ancient Mesopotamia. So the Sumerians called the opium poppy the joy plant because of the euphoria that results from taking opium. And so opium, we're going to do a little bit of a world tour here. Opium made its way through not just ancient Mesopotamia, but many other ancient civilizations as well. So from ancient Mesopotamia, we move to ancient Egypt, fast forwarding a couple thousand years, to ancient Egypt. There's this medical document called the Ebers Papyrus that mentions using opium for many different uses. Everything from curing breast abscesses, to hair care treatment, to being used as an aphrodisiac. And for this reason, all these many varied uses of opium in Egypt, poppy farming really thrived under the reign of King Tut and beyond. From Egypt, we move to ancient Greece, moving forward another couple hundred years in history. Has anybody read Homer's Odyssey? Or parts of it, maybe? I read parts in high school. So there's this quote in Homer's Odyssey where Helen of Troy is slipping a drug into wine and giving it to a group of people, and I'm going to read you this quote. Presently she cast a drug into the wine of which they drank, to lull all pain and anger, and bring forgetfulness of every sorrow. And it's been long debated what exactly this drug is that Helen of Troy is serving to her guests. But the most common interpretation of this right now is that this drug was in fact opium. And this follows because Hippocrates, who's known as the father of medicine, and for whom the Hippocratic Oath of medical ethics is named, also wrote about the use of opium to treat pain and various other diseases. From Greece, we really start to spread to the rest of the world. As Alexander the Great takes opium with him in his conquests, we spread to Persia and India. And then beyond that, we spread even further via the Silk Road into China. So we've moved now into AD, and we've moved all the way into China, where opium is being used. And this move into China transitions us into more modern history. So in the 1800s, opium and the opium trade becomes so important that wars are actually fought over opium. So in the mid-1800s, there are 2 opium wars fought between Britain and China, which are due to the fact that there's a trade imbalance going on, where there is more being exported from China to Britain than there is the other way around. And Britain is upset about this because they're buying silk and porcelain and tea from China and not sending much into China. And so Britain decides that they're going to smuggle opium into China, and as you may imagine, the Chinese officials are not so thrilled about this opium trade. And as a result, these wars are fought. And particularly of note here, the first Opium War results in the territory of Hong Kong being signed over from China to British rule. And so opium has become an important enough factor at play here that not only are wars being fought over it, but land is changing hands as a result. So meanwhile, in Germany, in 1803, we've got this guy, Friedrich Serturner, who's trying to figure out why opium actually has the effect that it does. And in trying to do this, he is able to identify the primary active component in opium, which he names morphine, after the god Morpheus, who's the Greek god of dreams, because opium causes people to sleep. Not long after that, in 1827, morphine is commercialized by Merck, and it's sold as this new miracle drug. It's prescribed widely for pain and anxiety and several other uses. It's called a wonder drug, and one of the co-founders of Johns Hopkins actually calls it God's own miracle, because it is derived from the opium plant. So in the corner here, you'll see this little 10x. So what I'm comparing here is the strength of some various drugs that we're going to talk about. So morphine is this tamed version of opium that's actually 10 times stronger than opium itself. So for those of you who are familiar, what I'm referring to here is the potency. So it's a little bit oversimplified here, but we're going to talk about it in terms of the strength of these different agents. After the commercialization, the commercialization of morphine, there's another great advance made by Alexander Wood in 1853. He invents the hypodermic syringe, which you may be familiar with if you've ever gotten a flu shot or some other kind of shot. So this is the very first use of that device, and this picture here on the top is actually that very first hypodermic needle that was ever used. And Alexander Wood uses this to inject morphine, and it's found that the injection of morphine directly into the bloodstream is 3 times more effective than just taking it by mouth. And so we're now at a count of 30 times the strength of opium. In the 1860s, our tale takes a turn for the worse. Morphine is widely used at this point, and it's used in the Civil War to treat soldiers who are in pain. And as a result, over 400,000 soldiers become addicted to morphine. So many that morphine addiction becomes known as soldier's disease. And we start to realize that morphine not only treats pain, but is also very addictive. And as a result, the late 1800s are then characterized by a search for a non-addictive pain medication in order to replace morphine. In 1874, Charles Romilly Alder Wright of England creates the first semi-synthetic opioid. So a semi-synthetic opioid is something that's taken directly from the opium plant and chemically altered in some way so that it is synthesized partially in a laboratory, but still comes from this natural opium source. So for example, Wright takes morphine and he alters it chemically to arrive at this structure. Now if you're not familiar with looking at chemical structures, don't worry. The point here is that these two structures are very much alike. With the exception of these portions that I'm highlighting in boxes, these are the only changes from one to the other. So the structure is very similar to that of morphine because it's based on morphine. Meanwhile, in Germany, completely independently, Felix Hoffmann and Heydrich Dreiser, who work for Bayer, developed this same drug. And Bayer commercializes this in 1898. And it becomes something that's used to give to especially children as a cough suppressant. It's used to treat pain and marketed as a new, safe, non-addictive alternative to morphine. And it's used as a step-down cure for people who are addicted to morphine. So much so that there's this philanthropic organization in New York called the St. James Society that has newspaper ads like this. So this says, morphine easy home cure, painless and permanent. And they're offering to send a free sample by mail to anyone addicted to morphine or opium or who has another drug habit of this new drug. And so you may be asking yourself at this point, well, why have I not heard about this miracle cure? And I'm here to tell you that you probably have, because in fact, from the Greek word for heroic, it's given the name heroin. Heroin was originally developed as a commercial drug and marketed as a safe and non-addictive painkiller. It's even more effective than morphine, so here we're up to 90x the strength of opium. But as you may be familiar, it turns out heroin's actually addictive. In fact, much more addictive than morphine. And so in 1913, production stops. And in 1924, the U.S. bans the manufacture, the importation, and the possession of heroin. And so, for this reason, the 1900s result in a continued search for a new non-addictive pain medication. So here's the structures again of morphine and heroin, very similar. There are many opioids further developed during this period. I'll just note a couple. So one is oxycodone in 1916. You can see here the structure, again, is very related to morphine and heroin. This is another semi-synthetic opioid that will come up again later. But the 1900s also results in this new generation of fully synthetic opioids. So things that act similarly in the body to how opium acts, but that are completely made from scratch in a lab, not actually derived from opium. And so probably most notable of these that you may be familiar with is fentanyl, developed in 1959. And you can see the chemical structure of this looks nothing like the others that I've showed you. But the strength, we've gotten much higher. We're now at 3,600 times the strength of opium. And so moving into a little bit more modern history, the 1980s are characterized by this period of fear called opiophobia, where doctors are afraid of prescribing opioids due to the fact that they're afraid their patients will become addicted to them. after that, in the 1990s, the pendulum swings so hard in the other direction as a result of new standards of care for pain management that we end up with overprescription of opioids. And opioids are prescribed very frequently in order to help manage pain. And this contributes to the rise of the abuse and addiction to opioids. In the 2000s, OxyContin is developed as a time-release opioid. So the main ingredient of OxyContin is that semi-synthetic opioid I mentioned earlier, oxycodone. But in these sorts of pills, the medicine is developed to release throughout the body over the course of about 12 hours, rather than all at once, so that they can be used to manage pain, but to curb the abuse of these drugs so that people can't just use them to get high. Unfortunately, it's not long before addicts realize that they can get around this by simply crushing the pills. And so there's work that's done to develop a similar time-release opioid that's not as crushable, but as you might imagine, it's very hard to get a pill that's both durable and actually has the effect in the body that you're going for once you give it to someone where you are trying to manage their pain. And so all of this then contributes to what you've probably read about in the news, the opioid epidemic or the opioid crisis. But lest I leave you with no hope that we find ourselves just in the middle of this terrible epidemic, we are doing things to move forward and to manage this. So in 2016, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention put out this guideline for prescribing opioids for chronic pain. This is a document aimed primarily at doctors to help inform safe use of the opioids that we currently have. In addition, there's lots of research being done to better understand what happens in addiction and overdose so that we're better able to treat these. And as a result of that further research and our better understanding of how opioids and addiction work, Narcan was developed as a drug to treat opioid overdose. And so what you may not realize is that Narcan itself is actually an opioid. So we're using an opioid to treat opioid overdose. So lest you leave with the impression that opioids are simply these terrible addictive drugs, they actually have many other effects. There are many different kinds of opioids. So Narcan is one example of this, a kind of opioid that has very beneficial effects. Another is something that you may have in your medicine cabinet at home. Imodium, the anti-diarrheal medication, is actually an opioid. And so as we further understand more and more about opioids and how they work, we're able to harness some of these beneficial effects of different types of opioids. And so there's much research currently going on in this area. As you may imagine, a lot of it has to do with dealing with pain. But if we've learned anything from the stories of morphine and heroin, and again, OxyContin, it's that we need to beware when something comes along as the next wonder drug, the next miracle cure to treat pain that's completely non-addictive. As it turns out, we are making progress in this area, but progress towards a non-addictive or less addictive pain medication is often much more gradual. But there's also research being done to harness some of these other effects of opioids, including my own research, which has to do with developing an opioid that can actually be used to treat addiction, not only to opioids, but to cocaine and many other classes of drugs of abuse. So if you're interested in learning more about that, shameless plug, I invite you to watch this video where I talk a little bit more about my own research and how we're looking to develop an opioid that could be used to treat addiction. And with that, I want to cycle back around to this question I posed at the beginning. Do we really need more opioids? I'll leave you to your own conclusion, but hopefully with the story that I've presented for you, you reach a similar conclusion to what I do, in that if we throw out opioid research and the development of opioids altogether, really what we're doing is throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
So we see them move from the natural, organic opioids to the synthetic. Was that done for, was that really pursued in order to reduce addiction, or was it an economic move in order to be able to produce greater volumes? Like, was it a big pharma thing back then?
That's a great question. So she's asking about this progression I showed from the natural opioids to the semi-synthetic to the synthetic, and the reasons behind that. So I will admit it's not quite as linear as I've showed it here. There are still people developing semi-synthetic opioids as well as completely synthetic opioids. And in terms of why any particular drug is developed, I think it's always valid to question that. Is it for financial gain, or is it to help actually fix a problem? And often my perspective is that those two things tend to go hand in hand, because in order to end with some financial gain, you need to be making something better than what's already out there.
Other questions? I was wondering, the first time you mentioned in early history, the first commercialization. Can you tell us a little bit more about how drugs get commercialized?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the answer for the first commercialization of morphine is very different than what the process looks like today, in large part due to the fact that it wasn't until, 3 or 4 decades after that commercialization that the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, was developed in the US. And so the commercialization process looks a little bit different country to country, or maybe a lot different depending on which country you pick. I'm obviously most familiar with the US system. And the development of a new medication tends to take 10 to 15 years once you start developing something into a drug. So the early research has to do with figuring out what the problem is, right? So maybe we know the problem is cancer, or the problem is Alzheimer's disease, or the problem is pain, but figuring out biologically what's actually gone wrong in the body that caused that problem. And then we look for a particular chemical that can help correct whatever's gone wrong in that biological change. And so that's where my portion comes in. There's a lot of chemistry. And when we find something that kind of works, we make slight changes to that chemical structure, trying to find something that really works, that works better. And as we develop more and more different, just slightly different chemicals to treat that, there's lots of biological testing that comes into that. And then you move into what Bruna had talked a little bit about with animal models. So there's lots of testing that happens in animals to check not only does the drug do what we want it to do, but also is it safe as much as we can know. Because we never 100% know, but because we do have the FDA in place with lots and lots of rules and regulations about that, to be as sure as we possibly can before a drug gets to the market. And so there's lots of testing in animals, and then moving into clinical trials where we test in people before it's finally approved and available.
Is there any basis to heroin, like reducing morphine addiction symptoms? Because I know now, like, we use like methadone and buprenorphine, which like are also opioids. So like, would you take like a small dose and no longer be stoned? Like,
yeah. So there is a little bit of basis to treating opioid addiction by giving someone another opioid. In that, where they started with this, what they're thinking is, oh, so someone is addicted to morphine, which the primary, might not be fair, one of the main causes of someone not being able to stop once they've started taking morphine is that they will experience withdrawal if they stop taking the drugs. And so they want to keep taking it. And so the basis there for giving someone heroin to step them down off of morphine is, oh, well, the thinking was heroin's not addictive, but it will keep someone from experiencing the symptoms of withdrawal because they still have something replacing that morphine in their system. Unfortunately, heroin itself was addictive, and so the withdrawal still took place. What they were hoping to do was to give smaller and smaller doses of heroin until somebody no longer had to take it. And so there are some countries where heroin addiction is treated with heroin, where you give someone in a controlled environment smaller and smaller doses to stop them off of it. So there is some basis behind that. Unfortunately, it wasn't the miracle cure we were looking for.
I have a question. I don't know if it's an ignorant question, but when you take a morphine or any kind of opiate for pain, is there any doses and also pain? The person has to experience a little pain, but not as much pain. Like, you know what I mean? That if you give, the doctor gives you morphine to feel completely no pain, right? Is it that we have to be willing to feel a little pain in order not to be addictive? I don't know.
Yeah,
Again, I don't know what it makes somebody, you know, what is the borderline or the tipping point when you become addicted?
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. I don't think we know exactly where that point is, where, right, how much of an opioid is too much of an opioid.
How much pain is too much pain.
But the thing that complicates that the most with opioids is something called tolerance, which means that when someone takes an opioid to control their pain, so if we give someone morphine, let's say we give them a dose, excuse me, of morphine, and it controls their pain just fine. Over time, so if you're looking at somebody who's experiencing chronic pain from something like cancer, where we're really trying to manage this severe pain that they're in, we give them that dose of morphine, and over time, that same dose won't be effective anymore. And so you have to gradually increase that dose in order to get the same effect. And it's that increasing dosage that makes opioids dangerous, because the higher the dose you take, the more likely you are to overdose and experience these other symptoms that eventually lead to addiction, but also death.
Based on your research, is there any kind of advice that you would give to like a significant other who has their loved one in the hospital and they're being asked for permission to administer some kind of opioid for like a car accident or something like that, you know? Do you have any kind of advice in that regard?
That's a really great question. I'm going to rely here on the fact that I'm not a medical professional and I don't want to give medical advice. And so what I would say is don't be afraid to ask questions of your doctors, or if you're maybe in the hospital, you're dealing with very harried doctors who don't have time, don't be afraid to call like a nurse hotline or somebody who is much more qualified to give that advice than I am. But this is definitely something that people are very aware of, and we're very much not in the same paradigm we were in the 90s, where opioids were kind of being handed out willy-nilly. And so my perspective is very much that opioids are not this thing that should never be used, that should be, you should be completely afraid of them, but rather we really need to be using them properly when warranted, and to be very careful monitoring that. And so I would not give the advice to, just steer clear of them, but rather to really make an informed decision. And I think the best way to do that is to talk to people who have that background knowledge.
So more about history. Is the opioid crisis same in all the countries in the world? Or is it more prevalent in certain areas of the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. He's asking about the prevalence of the opioid crisis in different areas. So it definitely extends beyond the United States. Opioids are a problem elsewhere as well. Currently, the most focus is on the United States, but it's interesting to look. I wish I could put a map up here. You can actually look for a map even by state. It varies widely where opioids are abused, and a lot of that is tied to how often they are prescribed, right? So these areas where they were over-prescribed. So about, I don't remember the exact date, but about 5 or 10 years ago, there's a map that shows the prescriptions. And for example, in the state of Michigan, in that year there were more prescriptions for opioids written than there are people in the state of Michigan. And now some of those, right, you're going to have people who legitimately have more than one opioid prescription in a year, who are experiencing chronic pain and need that to be renewed. But still, that just gives you a scope of the problem kind of here at home. And that definitely has tapered off as we're learning, better prescribing practices and how these things should be used. But it definitely does extend beyond the United States. My knowledge is concentrated here. But yeah, it differs widely based on how available the drugs are and how often the drugs are prescribed in other countries as well.
Do the scientists and the work that's being done in the lab, do you have interdisciplinary work with, for instance, psychology and psychiatry about the impact of addiction and the nature of, if there is a nature of someone, we always talk about the addictive personality in that.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. So my work is such early stages that we are not doing any kind of collaborative work with psychology or neuroscience so much, but there definitely are those collaborations going on, and that's something that I always come back to, is that addiction is really complicated, right? Most diseases are complicated, but addiction gets even more so because you have not only a physical component that we very much know is present, we know there are physical changes that happen in the brain as a result of drug addiction, but there's also an emotional component, there's a psychological component, there's a social component, right? And for these reasons, addiction really gets messy, and so I do think that interdisciplinary work is super important.
So that's our last talk for the night. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming out. Great talks from all our speakers. So thanks to Cultivate, of course, for hosting us here. A great place to be. This is our first time presenting in the tent. Once they turned the heat up, I think it got more comfortable. Again, if anyone came in late, I'm with Relate, and all our speakers went through the Relate workshop. So Relate is researchers expanding lay audience teaching and engagement. So researchers training researchers for lay audience communication. And if you want to learn more about us, you can go to learntorelate.org. And I see some laughter because what is a lay audience? But I think everyone did a great job with engaging talks today. So thanks to our speakers, thanks to everyone for coming, and have a great weekend.
That was really good.